Still all for the best, wagging tongues and all that. Said, Warnie, we've been here before. When's she off, Jack? I said, she's not. Well, not just yet, anyway. Oh, he said, I'm not surprised. The way the government works, take a long time, I've no doubt. Then it went silent. Thought, well, now that he's raised it, I better get it over with. Said, look, Warnie, there's something I want to tell you. Jack, he said, if you're about to tell me you're going to waste more money trying to change the British government's mind, I do not want to hear it. I said, no, Warnie, I've decided not to waste the money, waste any more money trying to change the British government's mind. Very wise, he said, Jack, very wise. I said, anyway, it's far cheaper to marry her. Well, this was a shallow conversation, as I said, and it was clear the penny had not dropped. But drop it eventually did. What? Are you serious, Jack? You're going to marry her? I said, yes, Warnie, it's the only way she can stay in the country. And don't worry, it's a marriage of convenience. Nothing's going to change. Nobody will know. Jack, he said, I can't believe it. I said, look, Warnie, you're a soldier. Look at it as a tactical maneuver to outflank the British government. Jack, he said, as an ex-soldier, what you call a tactical maneuver, we used to call a suicide mission. Well, it all went silent, and I thought, well, at least it's over with. But it wasn't. Suddenly he slammed his book shut and he said, oh, Jack, there's got to be another way. Surely there's another way. So I said, well, I suppose you could marry her, Warnie. I won't tell you what he said, but I will tell you that I was on my own in the garden for the rest of the afternoon. Well, now that that hurdle was over, the next hurdle was the marriage ceremony itself. That was in a marriage registry office in Oxford, in front of a very stern registrar. Now, I don't know what the situation is here, but if you marry in that type of place in England, it normally means there is something lurking in your past which precludes you from being married in a church. And this registrar had a very suspicious look. It's amazing how you can feel guilty for something you haven't done. Well, we muddled through, and I thought we were home free when suddenly she said something that I think we all should have anticipated. You may kiss the bride now, Mr. Lewis, if you wish. Well, Joy was horrified. Well, you'd be horrified if you had to kiss me, wouldn't you? Well, I'm referring to the ladies, of course. Warnie was in a state of apoplexy. So I said, look, would you mind if I do it later? And the registrar said, Mr. Lewis, I don't care whether you wait till doomsday. Then she signed the certificate, slapped it in my hand, and marched out of the room. Oh, I was glad to be out of that place. I went back to Magdalen. Joy went home. I think Roger took Warnie off for a stiff drink. Well, a sort of equilibrium had returned, and I still visited Joy, only a little bit more regularly, which of course irritated Warnie. I was going out one day, he said, Jack, why do you keep visiting this woman? I said, well, I am married to her, Warnie. So he said, I thought you said it was a tactical marriage. I said, well, these are only tactical visits. Well, at least he stopped talking about the neighbours. Joy made me laugh once. I was sitting with her and she started laughing. I said, why are you laughing? She said, don't you get the joke? I said, what joke? She said, well, here we are, the neighbours thinking that we're unmarried and up to all sorts of things, when all the time we're married and up to nothing at all. Our friendship continued to grow. She became as good a friend as any man friend I had. One night I praised her for her masculine virtues, but she soon put a stop to that by asking how I'd like to be praised for my feminine ones. And then there came another brushstroke. I was conducting a tutorial one morning at Magdalen, and there was a knock on the door. It was the porter. He put a little note in my hand. Mrs. Gresham has been rushed into hospital and she's asking for you. Well, as soon as I finished the tutorial, I, of course, went straight down to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, the receptionist said, the doctor wants to have a word with you before you go in and see Mrs. Gresham. So I said, all right. So I sat down and waited for the doctor, and he duly came with his clipboard, sat down with me, and there followed a conversation which could only have happened in a British hospital. So you're the Mr. Lewis she's been asking for, are you? I said, yes, I am. Well, he said, may I ask what relationship you are to Mrs. Gresham? I said, well, we're just good friends. Ah, he said, well, then perhaps you'll help us out. We have a few gaps in her admission form which we need to fill in. He said, could you tell me who her next of kin is? I said, well, actually I am. He said, I thought you said you were just good friends. I said, well, we are, but she's still my wife as well. I said, well, that's a rare occurrence around here. Have a wife who's a good friend. Well, he said, she gave her name as Mrs. Gresham. Should we change it to Lewis? I said, no, just think of it as her author's name. I said, well, can I have your full name? I said, yes, Clive Staples Lewis. Clive Staples Lewis. That's a coincidence, he said. I've just read a book by C.S. Lewis. You read any of his books, he said? I said, well, an Oxford Don's life is very busy. He said, well, I shouldn't worry, you haven't missed much. And then he got to the point. Sorry to tell you, Mr. Lewis, your wife is very ill. She has bone cancer. I said, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, it's terminal. We expect her to live weeks, maybe a few months. I said, have you told her? I said, no. We thought we would leave that to the next of kin. I said, thank you. One often reads about people being stunned when they get bad news. And one idly speculates on the absurdity of the expression. But there's truth in it. I felt I had just slipped over and hit my head on the floor. Well, I got to Joy's room, and when I went in, I was appalled. I had seen her a few days earlier, and though she did look a little off colour, she still looked reasonably well. Now her face was drawn, very pale, and even though her eyes were closed, they were sunken. And obviously, she was drugged and she was drifting in and out of sleep. So I sat there, and then she woke up for a period of time and looked at me, and she said, how long have you been here, Jack? I said, oh, 20 minutes or so. I'm dying, aren't I, Jack? Joy, I said, everybody is dying. Don't play with me, Jack. Yes, you're dying. How long, she said. Well, the doctor says it could be weeks, perhaps months. Oh, she said. And just when I'm beginning to win all our debates. She was a heroic woman. And her main concern, of course, were for the two boys. And once I had assured her on that point, then the only other concern she had was preparing them for that fateful day. But in all this, she maintained her perspective and she maintained her sense of humor. I remember one time I was with her, and she said, Jack, the funeral, I've got some savings that can cover that. Oh, I said, don't worry about that, Joy. Let the boys have the savings. I can cover that. Oh, I can't expect you to do that, she said. I said, why not? You are my wife. Oh, she said, that's a very good point. Oh, well, then you might as well go mad, mightn't you? And it was then that I realized I was hopelessly in love with her. I went back that day, and that night I just tossed and turned in bed. I was 50-odd years old, and I had never felt this way before. The next morning I cancelled my tutorials. I spruced myself up, put my best suit on, did my hair, polished my shoes, and found a tie that didn't have any stains on it. And I went to see her. When I walked into her room, she looked at me and she said, "Am I dead, Jack?" I said, "Why would you ask a question like that, Joy?" She said, "Well, looking at the way you're dressed, it looks as though you're going to a funeral." I said, "Joy, I think in the circumstances, that's a very flippant comment. Anyway," I said, "I've come to tell you I'm going to marry you." Well, she said, "Too late, Jack, I'm already married to some crazy Englishman." I said, "Be serious, Joy, I love you." She said, "And I love you, Jack. Have done so for some time." Well, I said, there it is then. I'm going to marry you properly before God, in the eyes of God." "Oh," well, she said, "at least I'll be legitimate when I get up there." And then she drifted off to sleep. A few minutes later, she woke up. "Jack," she said, "do Englishmen propose?" I said, "What, as in marriage?" She said, "Yes, as in marriage." I said, "Oh, yes, they do." "Oh," she said, "must have missed it." I said, "You didn't miss it, Joy. I just told you I'm going to marry you." "Oh," she said, "that's how you do it here." She said, "In America, when a man wants to marry a girl, he asks her, he doesn't tell her." She said, "I know it's silly, but the ladies love it." I said, "All right then, Joy." So I grabbed hold of her hand and she said, "Oh no, I want the works." I said, "What do you mean by the works?" She said, "One knee, the lot." I said, "Joy, I can't get down on one knee here. Somebody might burst in." She said, "Well, if they do, count slowly to 5, say a loud amen, and get up looking pious." Well, I did get down on one knee. I got it over with as quickly as I could because I was more concerned about the door opening. And I had one eye on the door, and when I had finished my proposal, I looked back and she'd gone back to sleep. I said, "I can't believe it. She wants me to propose and can't even stay awake for the end." And then she opened one eye. And she said, "All right, Jack, I will, but we can't keep getting married." So we were married at her hospital bedside. A vicar friend of mine conducted the ceremony. And I think that day I must have been the happiest and the proudest man in all of England. Of course, I wanted to take Mrs. Lewis back to the kilns, back here. So I asked the doctors whether she could come home. And they said, "Well, Mr. Lewis, we really can't do anything for her here, so yes, she can come home. It's as well for her to die under your roof than under this one." So Warnie and I made preparations to get her home, cleaning up, and it needed a clean up. And the night before she was due to come, Warnie said to me, "Jack," he said, "I've made arrangements for an unobtrusive withdrawal." I said, "Unobtrusive withdrawal? What do you mean?" He said, "Digs. I'm going to get digs. You know, two's company, three's a crowd." I said, "Warnie, I think you've got your arithmetic wrong. There are 2 boys, remember? That makes 4. "Oh, yes," he said. "Oh, well, that's settled then. I'll make it 5. Well, Joy did come home. And there was one more brushstroke. Remission. And it allowed us to throw ourselves into our marriage with the passion, if not the energy, of a pair of teenagers in love. In our own way, we feasted on love, every mode of it. Solemn and merry, romantic and realistic, sometimes as dramatic as a thunderstorm, and sometimes as unemphatic and as comfortable as putting on your soft slippers. Years ago, when I wrote about medieval love poetry, I was blind enough to treat it as a purely literary phenomenon. I know better now. I never realized I would have in my 60s the happiness that had passed me by in my 20s. Well, as the end of the third year of remission came upon us, Joy went along for one of her usual checkups. Ironically, it was probably the only checkup that we ever approached without any dread. Her health seemed so complete. But oh, how cruel life can be. The X-ray revealed that the cancer spots had returned to the bones. It was like being recaptured by the giant after you seemed to have got through every gate and are nearly out of sight of his castle. Well, now came the waiting. While we waited, we had to go on living. Could one ask for a second miracle? Joy grew weaker, but not so weak that she couldn't badger me to take her to Greece. And so I decided that as she had so long wanted to see the Parthenon, climb the steps of Mycenae, that we should go. And we went with two friends. And she was very resilient while we were there. I remember one night in the restaurant, she was in a very impish mood. There was an awful Greek band playing, and so she was getting little pellets of bread, rolling them in her finger and flicking them, trying to hit one of the band members. She was in good spirits when we got back. She had realized one of her greatest lifelong this worldly ambitions. The last time she was rushed into hospital, it was in great pain. But she never lost her perspective, nor her humor. Don't get me posh coffins, Jack. Posh coffins are all rot. I was with her when she died. Warnie and I were plunged into despair. Of course, Warnie had come to love her almost as much as I had, but of course in a different sort of way, seeing her as a sister we never had. He did as he had always done in a crisis. He turned to drink. I did as I had always done in a crisis. I picked up my pen and wrote. And the words were very angry to start off with. I was so angry with God. I don't think I was in any danger of ceasing to believe in him. The real danger was coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion I dreaded was not so there's no God after all, but so this is what God's like. I remember ranting one time to God. You led us up the garden path, didn't you? Time after time, when you seemed most gracious, you were really preparing the next torture. Of course, it was a yell. Little more than mere abuse, telling God what I thought about him. And of course, as in all abusive language, what I thought didn't really mean what I thought true. Only what I thought would offend him most. And then gradually my grief subsided. And I came to realize that I was looking at my situation from the wrong perspective. It was all about, before this, it was all about what we hadn't had rather than what we had. And I remembered that when we got married, that second time, and when she came home, we had expected to have maybe a few weeks, no more than a few months. and we had been given 3 years. And I came to see that he was the giver and she was the gift. And what a gift. She was my mother and my daughter, my pupil and my teacher, my subject and my sovereign, and always holding all these things in solution, my trusty comrade, friend, shipmate, fellow soldier. If we had never fallen in love, we should nonetheless been always together and created a scandal. I used to refer to her as a sword. Well, that's true as far as it goes, but utterly inadequate by itself and misleading. I ought to have balanced it. I ought to have said, but also like a garden, like a nest of gardens, wall within wall, hedge within hedge, more secret, more fertile, more fragrant, the further you entered. And then of her and of every created thing I praise, I should say, in some way, in its unique way, like him who made it. Thus up from the garden to the gardener, from the sword to the smith, to the life-giving life and the beauty. That makes beautiful. Do you know what I said to her near the very end? If you can, I said, if it is allowed, come to me when I too am on my deathbed. Allowed, she said. Heaven would have a job to hold me, and as for hell, I'd break it into bits. Oh, she knew she was speaking a kind of mythological language with even an element of comedy in it. There was a twinkle as well as a tear in her eye. But there was no myth, no joke, deeper than any feeling that flashed through her. Her last words to the chaplain were, I am at peace with God. Her last words to me were, you have made me very happy. And then she smiled. But she didn't smile at me. And she didn't smile at the chaplain. She had turned to the eternal fountain. And at that very moment she had entered in. And now her face shone with his reflected glory. We are all to shine like the sun. We are to be given the morning star. In one way, God has already given us the morning star. You can get up on many a fine morning and see the gift if you get up early enough. But you say, what more do we want? Well, we do want so much more. We don't merely want to see beauty, though God knows that that is bounty enough. We want something that can hardly be put into words. We want to pass into the beauty we see, become united with the beauty, receive it into ourselves. That's why the poets tell us such lovely falsehoods. They speak as if the west wind could really sweep into the human soul. But it can't. Yet, if we are to take the imagery of Scripture seriously, if we believe that God will one day give us the morning star, cause us to put on the splendor of the sun, then we may surmise that the poets, though very false as history, are very near the truth as prophecy. At the present, we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door. We discern the freshness and the purity of the morning, but they do not make us fresh and pure. We cannot mingle as we would like with the splendors that we see. But all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it shall not always be so. One day, God willing, we shall enter in, and in there, in beyond nature, we shall eat of the tree of life. But the cross comes before the crown. A cleft has opened in the pitiless walls of the world, and we are invited to follow our captain inside. I suppose it may be possible to think hereafter too much of our own glory, but I do not think it is possible to think too much or too often of our neighbor's glory. It is a serious thing to remember that we live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. There are no ordinary people. You have never spoken to a mere mortal. Natures, civilizations, arts, cultures, these are mortal. Their life to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is with immortals that we work, joke, snub, marry, exploit. Oh, I do not mean to say that we are to be perpetually solemn. We must play. But our merriment must be of that kind, and I think it is the best kind, which exists between people who have from the outset taken one another seriously. No presumption, no flippancy, no superiority. And our love must be a real and costly love, with deep feeling for the sins in spite of which we love the sinner. Not some indulgence or mere tolerance which parodies love as flippancy parodies merriment. I venture to suggest that your neighbor is one of the most precious objects presented to your senses, and one of the most important. And if he or she is your Christian neighbor, they are important in another way. Because in him and in her, Christ the glorifier, glory himself, is truly hidden. And if we are not only writers and scholars, but educators, then I think we can legitimately say that our pupils are our neighbors. I can't see anything in the nature of the younger generation which stops them from accepting Christianity. If somebody is prepared to tell them, many are ready to listen. And we face a challenge to be true to our Christianity and our calling. Well, I must stop. I think it's probably accurate to say that Warnie is not going to be back in time for me to make you a cup of tea. So I'm sorry about that. But I really have enjoyed your company. If you are ever in Oxford again, and I'm still around, you are welcome to a return visit. Till that time, enjoy yourselves. Have a good journey back to America. And thank you very much for coming to see us in our home.